The papers hit my chest before I even saw his hand move. "Sign it," Julian Vance said, and the whole dining room went quiet the way a forest goes quiet right before a gunshot. "Sign it, Mira, or I swear to God I will drag your father's name through every courtroom in this city until there's nothing left of it but ash." I looked down at the folder sliding off my lap onto the marble floor. Cream-colored pages, navy embossed seal, Petition for Dissolution of Marriage. I knew the font. I knew the exact weight of that paper between my fingers because I had held it before, 3 years from now, in a life that no longer technically existed, in a version of this exact dining room with the same chandelier throwing the same brittle light across the same faces. I had signed it that time. I remembered my hand shaking so hard the pen skipped twice before I could finish my own name. I remembered Eleanor Vance's smile. I remembered Sabrina's manicured fingers resting on Julian's forearm like she already owned it. I remembered walking out of this house with one suitcase and my father's voice on the phone, thin and scared, asking if it was true that the company was gone. I remembered, 6 months after that, standing at his grave in the rain because his heart had simply stopped taking the weight of it all. And I remembered, 2 years and 4 months after that, the smell of smoke and Eleanor Vance's face in a doorway, watching before she closed it. So, no, I did not look down at those papers the way I had the first time, like the floor had opened under me. I looked at them the way you look at a knife somebody else is holding backwards. "Pick it up," Julian said again, softer now, cruelty dressed up as patience, performing for the table. His mother at the head of it, sipping wine like this was theater she'd paid good money for. Sabrina, 2 seats down, my former best friend, wearing a bracelet I recognized because I used to own one just like it, before it went missing the week she moved into the guest wing to help me recover from my surgery. My surgery, the one Eleanor insisted I needed for a condition 3 different doctors later told me, in my first life, I never actually had. I bent down. I picked up the folder. I opened it to the signature line, and I smiled. Julian's face did something small and confused, a flicker, because a smile was not the correct response, and some animal part of him knew it. "You're right," I said. "This has gone on long enough." I took the pen from his hand before he could react, and I signed my name, clean, unshaking, final, on the first line. Then I turned the folder around and slid it back across the table to him. "Your turn." To understand why that moment tasted like victory instead of grief, you have to understand what the last 3 years of my first life had actually been. I married Julian Vance when I was 26, and stupid enough to believe that a man who cried at our wedding meant it. My father, Thomas Calloway, had built a small engineering firm out of a garage and a patent nobody believed in, a lithium cell architecture that reduced degradation by 60%, a decade before the market caught up to why that mattered. Vance Holdings wanted in. Julian courted the deal by courting me, and I was too in love to notice that the timeline of falling for me lined up suspiciously well with the timeline of needing my father's signature on a licensing agreement. The first year was fine. The second year, Eleanor started finding reasons I wasn't good enough. My clothes weren't refined enough. My manners weren't Vance enough. My background wasn't Vance enough, as if Julian himself hadn't grown up 2 towns from me eating the same gas station sandwiches. The third year, Sabrina came back into my life as if reborn out of nostalgia, my childhood best friend, the one who used to braid my hair at sleepovers, now suddenly always available, always around, always somehow standing a half step closer to my husband than a friend should stand. By year 4, I was being told I was sick. Not sick like a diagnosis, sick like a rumor, planted carefully, watered by Eleanor at dinner parties, until people who'd known me for a decade started asking my mother, gently, delicately, if I was doing better. I wasn't sick, I was being erased in slow motion, and I didn't understand it was a strategy until it was too late to stop. Because the strategy wasn't really about me at all. It was about my father's company and the fact that his patent, dismissed by everyone in year 1 as a nice small firm curiosity, was quietly becoming the single most valuable piece of intellectual property in the battery sector. Right as electric vehicle demand exploded 3 years ahead of when anyone expected it to. Vance Holdings didn't want a daughter-in-law. They wanted a controlling stake and a wife too destabilized, too isolated, too unwell to fight the paperwork when the merger papers came. They got what they wanted. In my first life, I signed everything. I signed the divorce. I signed away my shares, coerced by a lawyer Eleanor had personally selected for me, sold to me as on your side. I watched my father's company become a line item in Vance Holdings' portfolio. I watched him lose the thing that he'd built with his own two hands. And I watched him lose, not long after, the will to keep his heart beating through the loss of it. I moved into a studio apartment with peeling paint and a radiator that only worked if you hit it. I worked 3 jobs. I watched, from a careful and humiliating distance, as Julian and Sabrina got engaged in a ceremony written up in a magazine I used to subscribe to, in a dress I recognized because it was cut from a fabric line my father's old supplier used to source. And 2 years after that, I found out, through a mutual friend who still had the decency to feel guilty about it, by upon the Simsa, that Eleanor had never actually let the original patent paperwork transfer cleanly. There was a discrepancy, a loose end, something that, if it ever surfaced, could unwind the entire merger and hand my father's IP back to his estate, back to me. I went to get proof. I went to the old house late because I still had a key nobody had thought to take from me. The one oversight in an otherwise flawless campaign of erasure. I found the file. I photographed it. I never made it out with the photographs. The last thing I remember from that life is smoke thick enough to taste and Eleanor Vance's silhouette in a doorway, watching me go down. Before the door closed without her ever calling for help, I woke up in my own bed, in my own body, 3 years younger, on the exact morning of the exact dinner where Julian first threw divorce papers at me as a threat instead of a filing. I woke up with every memory of everything that came after intact, sharp, complete, sitting behind my eyes like a loaded weapon nobody in this house knew I was holding. They thought they were dealing with the same woman. They were not. Julian stared at the folder I'd slid back to him like it had grown teeth. "What are you doing?" he said. Not a question, an accusation dressed as one. "Signing," I said pleasantly. Isn't that what you wanted? You've been waving that thing at me for 2 years like it's a leash, Julian. Every time I disagreed with your mother, every time I asked a question about the company finances, every time I noticed Sabrina's coat in our hallway at 7 in the morning. You'd pull it out and threaten me with it like I was supposed to be grateful you hadn't filed yet. I tapped the signature line. "I'm just saving you the trouble of asking twice." Eleanor set her wine glass down with a click that was probably meant to sound like control and instead sounded like alarm. "Mira." Her voice had the honeyed edge she used when she wanted witnesses to think she was being reasonable. "There's no need to be dramatic. Julian is simply frustrated. Marriages have rough patches. Eleanor," I said, and I watched her blink because I never called her by her first name, not once, not in 3 years, not even in my head. In my head, she had always been Mrs. Vance, a title I'd been trained into using the way you train a dog with a shock collar. "We both know this isn't a rough patch. We both know exactly what this is." Sabrina's hand, still resting on Julian's arm, went very still. "You don't know what you're talking about," Julian said. But the confidence had a hairline crack running through it now because in 3 years of marriage, I had never once talked back at this table, and the woman doing it now was wearing my wife's face and none of my wife's fear. "I know you've been telling people I'm unwell," I said. "I know your mother started that particular rumor at the Whitmore's anniversary party 14 months ago over the second course. To Diane Whitmore specifically because Diane can't keep a secret to save her life, and Eleanor knew it would spread by Monday." Eleanor's face didn't move, but her knuckles went white around the stem of her glass. "I know Sabrina's been staying in the guest wing for moral support since March, and that her lease on the Hartwell Street apartment accidentally lapsed the same week she moved in, which is a remarkable coincidence for someone as organized as she's always claimed to be." Sabrina opened her mouth. Nothing came out. "And I know, I'm same," said. And here I let my voice drop, quiet, almost gentle, the way you'd deliver the last line of a story to someone who still thought it had a happy ending. "That this dinner, this exact dinner, was never about me disappointing anyone. It was about my father's patent filing coming up for its licensing renewal next quarter, and Vance Holdings needing a clean, uncontested divorce settled before that renewal. so that my shares transfer without a fight and nobody has to negotiate with an inconvenient wife who might start asking her lawyer real questions. The silence that followed had a texture to it. I'd felt it before once, in a version of this life that no longer existed. The silence right before Eleanor realized the game had changed and she hadn't been told the new rules. "That's absurd," Julian said, too fast. "Is it?" I said. "Then you won't mind if I call my father's counsel in the morning and have them do a full audit of the joint filings before we finalize anything." I closed the folder gently, the way you'd close a book you already knew the ending to. "I'll sign whatever you want, Julian. I've been ready to sign for longer than you know. I just want you to be very, very sure you want this particular door open because once it is, I am not the one who's going to be standing on the wrong side of it." Here's the thing about being reborn with 3 years of memory nobody else has. It isn't magic, not really, not in the way people imagine when they hear a phrase like second chance. It's something colder and more useful than magic. It's a map. I knew which quarter the semiconductor supply shock would hit and gut half the EV sector before the executives at Vance Holdings did. I knew which of Eleanor's safe real estate holdings were actually collateralized 3 times over on paper nobody had bothered to reconcile. I knew Sabrina had a habit, because I'd overheard her once in my old life, drunk and smug at an office party months after the divorce was final, of keeping incriminating texts in an old phone she thought she'd wiped, because she didn't understand that a factory reset doesn't always mean what she thought it meant. Most of all, I knew where my father's original patent documentation actually was, because I remembered, with the perfect clarity of a wound that never closed, the exact drawer in the exact filing cabinet in the Vance Holdings legal office where Eleanor had personally hidden the unsigned transfer discrepancy. The loose end she thought no one would ever find, because the only person who might have looked was the daughter-in-law she'd already spent 2 years convincing everyone was too unstable to be believed. The first thing I did the morning after that dinner was not confront anyone. Confrontation is what you do when you don't have a plan and need the other side to blink first. I had a plan. I had 3 years of one, built silently while everyone at that table was still congratulating themselves on how well the campaign against me was going. I went to see my father. Thomas Calloway was 61 years old, still built like the machinist he'd been before he was ever an executive, hands permanently stained, faintly with graphite, and grease no amount of soap ever fully lifted. In my old life, by this point, he was already starting to look smaller, already starting to fold in on himself under the slow-motion pressure of watching his company get absorbed into something that wore his name on the letterhead and none of his values anywhere else. In this life, he was still whole, still laughing easily, still mine to save. "You look like your mother did the week before she left your grandmother's law firm to start the workshop with me," he said, studying my face over coffee in his kitchen. The same chipped mugs, the same cracked linoleum he refused to replace out of some stubborn engineer's loyalty to things that still functioned. "That's not a compliment or a criticism. It's just an observation." "What's going on, Mira?" "Dad," I said, "I need you to trust me on something, and I need you to not ask me how I know it." He set his mug down. He didn't say that's not how trust works or you have to give me something. He just looked at me the way he used to look at a machine that had started making a sound it shouldn't, patient, curious, ready to listen before he touched anything. "Okay," he said, "the patent renewal next quarter. I need you to quietly bring in outside counsel, not the firm Vance Holdings recommended, someone completely separate, someone Eleanor Vance has never heard of, and have them do a full chain of title audit on the original licensing transfer. Every signature, every date. I think there's a discrepancy buried in it, something that was never properly executed. And I think if it comes to light at the wrong time, in the wrong hands, it could either destroy the whole agreement or hand you back full control. I need to know which before anyone else does." He was quiet for a long moment, turning his mug slowly on the table, the way he used to think through a design flaw before he ever picked up a tool. "This have something to do with why Julian's mother's been so friendly with Sabrina Cole lately?" I blinked. "You noticed that. I'm your father, not blind." He almost smiled, though there was no real humor in it. "I've noticed a lot of things I didn't want to say out loud because you seemed happy, and I didn't want to be the man who ruins his daughter's marriage over a bad feeling." His jaw tightened. "Tell me what you need, sweetheart. Whatever it is." I built this company with these two hands, and I am not interested in watching anyone take it out of them without a fight. I need you to trust me for 6 months, Ahmed, and I need you to let me handle the parts that are about to get ugly. The next months were the quietest, most dangerous work I have ever done, and none of it looked like war from the outside. From the outside, I was the same woman who'd sat at that dinner table, gone slightly stiller, slightly more watchful, but still showing up to the Vance family events, still smiling at the right moments, still letting Eleanor believe her campaign was proceeding exactly on schedule, because a trap only works if the thing it's trying to catch doesn't know it's a trap yet. I hired my own counsel, not through any firm connected to the Vances, a woman named Priya Nandakumar, who had a reputation for being quiet, thorough, and merciless in exactly that order. I gave her the file location from memory, phrased carefully as, I have reason to believe there may be an irregularity in this specific drawer of this specific cabinet, and let her people find the paper trail through entirely legitimate discovery channels so that when it surfaced, it would surface as her work, her diligence, nothing that could ever be traced back to a wife who supposedly shouldn't have known where to look. What we found was worse for the Vances than even I remembered. The original transfer of my father's patent licensing rights into the marital trust. The structure Eleanor had insisted was standard practice, the structure my father's own lawyer at the time, handpicked by Julian, had assured him was airtight, had never been properly executed under the terms of the original partnership agreement. There was a missing countersignature, a registration that had lapsed by 4 days due to what looked, on paper, almost too cleanly, like deliberate negligence. In my old life, this discrepancy would have stayed buried forever because nobody with the authority to look ever had a reason to. Now I had the reason. And I had something else my old life never gave me. Time to use it before anyone knew to be afraid. I found Sabrina's old phone the way I remembered it existing. Not hacked, not stolen. Simply known about because in my old life, she'd bragged about it once, drunk, to a room of people who no longer mattered, describing exactly which junk drawer and exactly which apartment held the phone she thought she'd wiped clean before donating it to a charity Dropbox that, conveniently, never actually processed the device before the drive went into storage. A woman who works in a charity's back office doing me an enormous, unknowing favor confirmed the device was still sitting untouched in an inventory bin awaiting a data wipe contractor who was, at the moment, 6 weeks behind schedule. I didn't touch it. I am not a criminal. Whatever Eleanor liked to imply about my instability, I simply made sure Priya's team knew, through entirely proper subpoena channels once the divorce filing made discovery relevant, exactly which device to request preservation of and exactly why its contents might be material to a claim of marital fraud. And I made sure, quietly, patiently, month by month, that my own financial position had nothing left in it that Eleanor could threaten. I opened accounts she didn't know about. I moved what modest independent savings I had into instruments Julian's family had no visibility into. I did something else, too, something that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with the one piece of foreknowledge I valued more than any of it. I quietly, personally, using money that was entirely mine, took a position in the exact battery materials suppliers I remembered surging when the semiconductor shock hit the EV sector 8 months from now. Not through any account connected to Callaway Engineering. Not through anything Eleanor's people could later claim was insider knowledge tied to my father's IP. Just a woman with a strange, specific hunch, moving her own modest inheritance into a handful of unglamorous mid-cap suppliers nobody at that dinner table would have thought twice about because nobody at that table had ever asked me a single real question about what I did with my own money. They'd spent 3 years deciding I wasn't smart enough to be asked. That was, in the end, their whole mistake, repeated in every version of the story. They never once, not for a single day, imagined I might be the one holding the better hand. The divorce filing itself, the real one, filed properly through Priya's office rather than the folder Julian had thrown at me like a weapon, happened 4 months after that dinner. By then, Eleanor's campaign to paint me as unstable had quietly stalled, not because I'd fought it directly, but because I'd stopped giving it anything to feed on. I showed up composed. I showed up prepared. I answered every leading question at every family function with a calm, specific, factual response that made the person asking it look faintly ridiculous for having asked. Rumors need friction to survive. I simply stopped providing any. Sabrina, for her part, made her own mistakes without any help from me at all. She got comfortable too fast. She stopped being careful the way people do when they think they've already won, and comfortable people leave trails. She started appearing at events on Julian's arm before the ink on anything was dry, confident that whatever image problem that created would land on me instead of them, because that was how it had always worked before. It was Eleanor who made the error that mattered most, though, and she made it because she still fundamentally believed she was dealing with the same frightened, isolated woman from 3 years of careful erasure. 2 weeks before the discovery deadline, with the patent chain of title audit quietly working its way toward becoming public record, Eleanor invited me to lunch. Just the two of us. An overture, she called it. A chance to handle this like family without lawyers making everything so ugly. I remembered this lunch. In my old life, it hadn't happened, yes. There had been no need for Eleanor to extend an olive branch to a woman who'd already signed away everything without a fight. This time, my composure had unsettled her enough that she needed to know what she was actually dealing with. Needed to see my face up close and decide whether I was bluffing. We sat at a small restaurant she chose, the kind with cloth napkins and a maitre d' who knew her by name, and she smiled at me across a plate of food neither of us touched. "I want you to know," she said, "that none of this was ever personal, Mira. Business is business. You understand that?" "I do," I said. "Which is why I want you to understand something too, Eleanor. I know about the 4-day lapse in the countersignature registration on my father's licensing transfer. I know it was never corrected because correcting it would have required disclosing that the original transfer was never properly executed in the first place. I know Sabrina's old phone is currently sitting in a charity donation bin with a preservation hold on it as of Tuesday. And I know that if any of this becomes public in the middle of a contested divorce, Vance Holdings' board is going to ask some very uncomfortable questions about who exactly structured the original deal and why." Eleanor's fork stopped halfway to her mouth. "You're bluffing," she said, but her voice had lost the honey. "I'm really not," I said. "I've spent 3 years listening to you decide out loud in front of me that I was too fragile and too foolish to ever be a threat to anything you cared about. That was your whole strategy, Eleanor. It worked for a long time." I folded my napkin and set it down, unhurried. "I'd like you to sit with the specific feeling of realizing it just stopped working, because I promise you it's the last calm moment you're going to get for a while." The board meeting where it all came apart happened 3 weeks later, and I wasn't in the room for it. I didn't need to be. Priya's discovery filing had by then done what discovery filings do when the underlying facts are this ugly. It had made the private public in exactly the way that terrifies people like Eleanor Vance. People whose entire currency is the appearance of control. The countersignature lapse meant the original transfer of my father's patent rights into the marital trust had never been legally sound. Combined with the timeline on a transfer whose paperwork failure conveniently coincided with the exact period Vance Holdings' internal valuation models first identified the patent's long-term worth. Priya's filing painted a picture that was almost impossible to read as an accident. It read, instead, like a company that had knowingly structured a defective transfer to keep leverage over the true owner, planning to correct it quietly only once the marriage that gave them access was safely, permanently dissolved on favorable terms. Sabrina's phone, once the preservation order forced its actual recovery, turned out to contain exactly what I remembered it containing. Messages between her and Eleanor from over a year before Julian ever threw those first papers at me, discussing timing, not romance timing, the actual cold calendared logistics of when it would be cleanest for Sabrina to step in relative to the patent renewal schedule. It was never a love story that went sideways. It had been a plan from the start, and the messages proved it in Eleanor's own words, sent from her own device discussing her own son's marriage, like a supply chain problem to be optimized. By the time the board saw all of it laid out in Priya's filing, the calculus had changed entirely. A merger built on a defective transfer, propped up by a scheme this documented, wasn't an asset anymore. It was a liability with legal exposure attached to every board member who'd signed off on the valuation without asking harder questions. 3 of them, I later learned, called for Eleanor's removal from any operational role within 48 hours of the filing becoming public. Less out of any moral objection than out of pure, cold self-preservation. And underneath all of it, quietly, without any fanfare, The semiconductor shock hit exactly when I remembered it hitting. EV suppliers scrambled. Vance Holdings, overexposed in exactly the positions I remembered them being overexposed in, took a hit that made headlines for a week. My own small, unglamorous position in the mid-cap suppliers I'd moved my modest savings into 8 months earlier didn't make headlines anywhere. It simply, quietly, tripled. I saw Julian one more time before everything finalized, and it wasn't in a courtroom, though the court paperwork was already essentially decided by then. A clean, favorable settlement that returned my father's AP fully and cleanly to his estate, with damages attached for the defective transfer that made the number embarrassing for Vance Holdings to even discuss publicly. It was outside my father's workshop on an ordinary Tuesday, and he was standing in the parking lot like a man who'd shown up somewhere without a plan for what to say once he got there. He looked different than he had at that dinner table, thinner in the face. The confidence that used to sit on him like a tailored jacket had come loose at the seams, hanging wrong. "My mother's been removed from the board," he said without any greeting. "Sabrina's gone. She left the day the messages went public. Didn't even take her things from the house." He laughed, short and humorless. "Funny, I spent 3 years thinking you were the fragile one." "I know," I said. "I don't understand how you knew," he said. "About the phone, about the transfer, any of it. Nobody could have known all of that." I could have told him the truth, that I'd lived this exact betrayal once already, in a version of this life he would never believe existed, that I had died once already because of the loose end his mother left dangling, that everything he was watching collapse now had already collapsed once before in a version of events only I remembered. I thought about it for exactly as long as it takes to breathe once. "You spent 3 years deciding I wasn't paying attention," I said instead. "That was never true. I was always paying attention, Julian. I just finally stopped letting any of you see it." He looked down at the ground between us, and something in his shoulders folded, the way something folds when a person finally understands, too late, the actual size of what they've lost. "I'm sorry," he said. "I know that doesn't mean anything now, but I am." "I believe you," I said, and I did. I believed that he was sorry the way people are sorry when the consequences finally arrive, which is different from being sorry before they do. It doesn't change anything, but I believe you. I didn't wait to see if he'd say anything else. I got in my car and I drove to my father's workshop where he was standing in the doorway grinning like the last 3 years hadn't put a single gray hair on his head, holding 2 cups of coffee in the same chipped mugs, because some things, thank God, you get to keep exactly the same the second time around. "Board just confirmed it this morning," he said, handing me a mug. "Full IP rights, reinstated, clean. And apparently there's already interest from 2 manufacturers who want an exclusive license once the renewal clears." He shook his head, half laughing, half like he still couldn't believe it. "I don't know what you did, Mira. I'm not sure I want to know all of it, but whatever it was, thank you." "You built something worth protecting," I said. "I just made sure the people trying to steal it had to answer for it." 6 weeks later, I signed the final settlement papers in Priya's office on my own terms at my own table, with nobody standing over my shoulder threatening to drag anyone's name through anything. I signed my name the same way I had at that dinner all those months before, clean, unshaking, final, except this time there was nothing left of my old life bleeding through the ink. This time the signature was simply mine, on a door I was closing on my own terms, walking toward a life that for once I had built entirely without anyone's permission. I heard, months later, secondhand, through people who still like to talk, that Julian had shown up at my father's office uninvited, asking, of all things, if there was any chance at all of starting over, that he'd stood in the lobby long enough that security had to ask him to leave, that when he finally did, he'd said to no one in particular that he never should have thrown those papers at me in the first place. I didn't need to see it to believe it. I'd already lived the version of the story where I was the one who ended up on my knees, begging a world that had already decided I didn't matter to please. Please give me back some small piece of what I'd lost. This time, I was the one who got to walk away whole. And that, more than any settlement number, more than any board seat, more than any quiet, satisfying account balance, tripling in the dark while no one was watching, that was the thing I'd actually been fighting for the whole time. Not revenge, just the simple, ordinary right to never again be the one who has to beg.